Judge frames innocent black twins for a crime they didn't commit. And it's only when they call their dad the U.S. Attorney General that everything changes. But can a man who abandoned his family years ago really save them now? The courtroom is set, the stakes are high, and a corrupt judge with a history of prejudice will stop at nothing to make sure the twins pay the price. What happens when the law itself becomes the enemy? And can a fractured family repair the past while fighting for the truth? This isn't just a battle for justice. It's a fight for redemption. Don't miss this shocking story of betrayal, courage, and a fight for what's right. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The late afternoon sun painted the suburban streets in warm golden light, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns. Maya and Mia Carter, 7-year-old twins with matching pink helmets, pedaled their bikes around the quiet cul-de-sac. Their laughter echoed through the peaceful neighborhood as they raced each other in circles, their matching braids swaying with each push of the pedals. "Can't catch me," Mia called out, her braids bouncing as she pedaled faster. Her purple bike sparkled in the sunlight, decorative streamers flowing from the handlebars like ribbons dancing in the breeze. Maya, riding her identical bike in blue, leaned forward with determination. "Just watch me." She picked up speed, her face breaking into a wide grin as she gained on her sister. The wind whistled past her ears as she pedaled harder. From the front porch, Marissa Carter watched her daughters with a gentle smile, her heart swelling with pride and love. She sat in her favorite wicker chair, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands. The sight of her girls playing so freely helped ease the tension from her shoulders after a long week at work. These were the moments that made everything worthwhile. "Be careful, girls," she called out when they took a turn a bit too sharply. But her warning held more warmth than worry. These peaceful moments were precious to her, snapshots of childhood joy she wished she could freeze in time. The twins continued their game, weaving patterns across the street. Their bikes hummed against the pavement as they rode, occasionally hitting small bumps that made them giggle and bounce in their seats. The neighborhood was quiet except for the sound of their joy and the distant chirping of birds in the maple trees that lined the street. Mrs. Beasley, their elderly neighbor with silver hair neatly pinned back, appeared at the corner of the street. She walked slowly, her sensible shoes clicking against the sidewalk as she carried her small shopping bag as she usually did on her afternoon walks to the corner store. "Hi, Mrs. Beasley," the twins called out in unison, waving enthusiastically as they passed her, their voices bright and cheerful. Mrs. Beasley looked up and offered a small wave back, her wrinkled face forming a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. But something seemed off about her usual warmth. Her eyes darted around distractedly, and she clutched her shopping bag closer to her chest, her knuckles white against the plastic handles. The twins didn't notice anything unusual, lost in their own world of make-believe races. They were too caught up in their game, continuing to circle the cul-de-sac as Mrs. Beasley made her way to her house 3 doors down, her steps slightly quicker than usual. "Girls, 10 more minutes," Marissa called from the porch. The sun was starting to dip lower, casting orange streaks across the sky and turning the clouds into cotton candy colors. "Okay, Mom," Maya shouted back while Mia made one last victory lap around their imaginary racetrack, her arms raised in triumph. The evening passed quietly, filled with the normal routines of family life. After dinner, the twins headed upstairs to get ready for bed, their earlier energy mellowing into sleepy contentment. They stood side by side at their bathroom sink, brushing their teeth with matching butterfly toothbrushes, their pajamas decorated with colorful stars. "I almost won that last race," Maya said through a mouthful of toothpaste, her eyes meeting her sister's in the mirror. Mia giggled, accidentally dribbling some toothpaste down her chin. "Did not." She wiped her chin with the back of her hand, leaving a smear of white. As they rinsed their mouths, they heard their mother's voice floating up from downstairs. She was on the phone, her tone different from her usual cheerful evening calls with their aunt. There was an edge to it that made both girls pause. "Are you sure?" they heard her say, her voice trembling slightly. "But that doesn't make any sense." The worry in her words was clear even from upstairs. The twins exchanged curious looks in the bathroom mirror, their toothbrushes forgotten in their hands. Maya reached over and turned off the faucet so they could hear better, the sudden silence making their mother's voice seem louder. "Yes, I understand," Marissa continued, her voice growing fainter as she moved around downstairs. "But they were just... No, I see. Yes, I'll be there first thing." Her footsteps paced back and forth across the kitchen floor. The girls couldn't make out the rest of the conversation, but they could hear the worry in their mother's voice. It was the kind of tone she used when something was really wrong, like the time Mia had fallen off the swing set and needed stitches. It was her serious voice, the one that made their stomachs twist with concern. "What's wrong with Mom?" Mia whispered to Maya, her earlier playfulness replaced with concern. She grabbed her sister's hand, seeking comfort in the familiar touch. Maya shrugged, but she felt a small knot forming in her stomach. "Maybe she's just tired from work," she suggested, trying to sound more confident than she felt. They finished getting ready for bed in unusual silence, both straining to hear more of their mother's conversation. When the phone finally clicked in its cradle downstairs, they heard their mother let out a long, shaky breath that seemed to echo through the quiet house. The early morning silence was broken by thunderous knocking at the front door. Maya Carter stirred in her bed, pulling her pink comforter closer as she tried to make sense of the noise. Her heart pounded against her chest as the knocking grew more insistent. Across the room, her twin sister Mia sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her long dark hair tangled from restless dreams. "What's that sound?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She clutched her favorite stuffed rabbit tighter to her chest. Before Maya could answer, they heard their mother's footsteps rushing down the hallway, the quick padding of bare feet against carpet, followed by the sound of the front door opening. Harsh voices filled their usually peaceful home, echoing off the walls like angry thunder. "Mrs. Carter, step aside," a deep voice commanded, leaving no room for argument. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs, each thud making the twins' hearts race faster. Maya and Mia exchanged worried glances as their bedroom door burst open with a bang that made them both jump. Two police officers in dark uniforms towered in the doorway, their faces stern and unyielding in the dim morning light that filtered through their butterfly curtains. "These are the ones," one officer said to the other, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. They moved swiftly into the room, their heavy boots leaving marks on the pale carpet. "What's happening?" Maya cried out as rough hands pulled her from her bed. The cold metal of handcuffs clicked around her small wrists, biting into her skin. Beside her, Mia began to sob as she received the same treatment, her stuffed rabbit falling forgotten to the floor. "Mommy!" Mia screamed, tears streaming down her face, leaving wet trails on her cheeks. Their mother appeared in the doorway, her face pale with shock, still wearing her flowered nightgown from the night before. "Stop this! They're just children," Marissa pleaded, following the officers as they led the twins down the stairs. The girls stumbled in their matching unicorn pajamas, their bare feet cold against the wooden floor. Maya could feel every groove and bump in the wood beneath her feet as they were hurried along. A tall man in a crisp gray suit stood in their living room, his badge gleaming under the early morning light streaming through the windows. "Detective Logan," he introduced himself curtly. "Mrs. Carter, your daughters are being taken in for questioning regarding an assault on Mrs. Beasley. She was found unconscious in her home last night." "That's impossible." Marissa's voice cracked with desperation, her hands shaking as she gestured wildly. "They were home all evening. They went to bed right after dinner. We watched a movie together." "We have witness statements placing them at the scene," Detective Logan stated flatly, his expression unchanging. "The evidence is clear." "What evidence?" Marissa demanded, moving to stand between her daughters and the door, her body trembling but determined. "They're 7 years old. This is absurd. They can barely reach the kitchen counter." The officers pushed past her, dragging the terrified twins toward their patrol car. Maya could barely see through her tears as they were led outside, the morning sun barely peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Neighbors were starting to emerge from their homes, watching the scene unfold with a mix of curiosity and judgment. Some stood in their bathrobes, whispering behind their hands, while others pretended not to notice. "Please," Marissa begged, following them onto the front lawn, her bare feet collecting dew from the grass. At least let them get dressed. They're in their pajamas. They'll freeze. Detective Logan shook his head, his jaw set firmly. There's no time for that. The situation is serious, Mrs. Carter. Your daughters need to be questioned immediately. The twins were lifted into the back seat of the police car, their small hands still bound behind them. Through the window, Maya could see her mother's face crumpling as she watched helplessly, looking smaller and more vulnerable than Maya had ever seen her. "Mommy, help us!" Mia cried out as the car door slammed shut with a sound that seemed to echo through the quiet neighborhood. Marissa stood on the porch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as the police car pulled away from the curb, its engine rumbling through the morning quiet. She remained frozen in place, watching long after the car had vanished, the morning sun casting long shadows across her tear-stained face. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs as she stared at the empty street. The peaceful neighborhood now seemed eerily quiet, broken only by the whispers of neighbors and the distant sound of birds beginning their morning songs. A newspaper boy rode past on his bicycle, pretending not to notice the scene. Marissa stood alone on her porch, the weight of helplessness crushing down on her as she stared at the empty street where the police car had disappeared with her precious daughters. The morning dew soaked through her thin nightgown, but she didn't seem to notice the cold. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the police station as Marissa Carter burst through the front doors, her heart pounding against her ribs. The morning sun streamed through the windows, but inside, everything felt cold and sterile. The sharp scent of cleaning products and stale coffee hung in the air. "I need to see my daughters," she demanded, her voice cracking as she approached the front desk. Maya and Mia Carter. They were brought in this morning. Her fingers gripped the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. A uniformed officer led her down a narrow hallway to an interrogation room, his boots clicking against the linoleum floor. The metal chair scraped against the floor as Marissa sat down across from Detective Logan, whose stern face showed no hint of sympathy. His badge gleamed under the harsh lighting. "Mrs. Carter," he began, shuffling through some papers, "your daughters are being held on serious charges. Mrs. Beasley was found unconscious in her home last night. She identified your girls as her attackers." He spoke with the detached tone of someone reading a grocery list. Marissa's hands trembled in her lap. "That's impossible. They were home with me all evening. They wouldn't hurt anyone. They're 7 years old, for heaven's sake." She could picture her daughters' faces, their matching brown eyes wide with fear. "The community is very concerned about youth violence," Detective Logan continued, his voice flat. "These accusations are being taken very seriously." He tapped his pen against the stack of papers. "What evidence do you have?" Marissa leaned forward, her eyes searching the detective's face. "You can't just lock up 2 little girls based on one person's word." Her chest tightened with each passing moment. "Mrs. Beasley's statement is quite detailed." Detective Logan's chair creaked as he shifted. "Given the nature of the crime, we're pursuing charges against your daughters as adults." His words fell like stones in the quiet room. The words hit Marissa like a physical blow. "As adults? They're children. This is insane. Where are they? I demand to see them right now." Her voice echoed off the bare walls. "That won't be possible at the moment," Detective Logan replied, gathering his papers. "They're being processed." He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Processed?" Marissa's voice rose. "They're probably terrified. They need their mother." She could almost hear their cries for her. Outside the interrogation room, she could hear phones ringing and voices discussing the Carter case. Her stomach churned as she realized how quickly this nightmare was spreading through their small town. The whispers and shuffling feet seemed to mock her. "Detective?" Marissa tried again, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Please, there has to be some mistake. Just let me see my daughters." She blinked back tears that threatened to fall. But Detective Logan had already stood up, his expression unchanged. "An officer will escort you out, Mrs. Carter. We'll be in touch." He turned his back, dismissing her completely. Marissa's legs felt weak as she walked through the station lobby. Through the windows, she could see news vans pulling up outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. Camera crews were already setting up their equipment. The morning sun felt too bright as she stepped outside, the weight of what was happening pressing down on her shoulders. Her little girls were somewhere in this building, alone and scared, while the whole town was already condemning them. The autumn breeze carried the sound of distant sirens. She gripped her car keys tightly, feeling the metal bite into her palm. The unfairness of it all, the accusations, the lack of evidence, the cold treatment from the police, made her want to scream. But she couldn't fall apart. Not now. Not when Maya and Mia needed her to be strong. She straightened her shoulders, already planning her next move. Her daughters wouldn't face this alone. The living room was dark except for the harsh blue glow of the television. Marissa Carter sat on the edge of her couch, her fingers clutching the remote so tightly her knuckles turned white. She flipped through channels mechanically, but every news station showed the same thing. Her daughter's school photos side by side with dramatic headlines about youth violence. In a shocking development, the news anchor's voice filled the room. Twin sisters Maya and Mia Carter have been charged with the assault of elderly resident Eleanor Beasley. Sources say the attack was unprovoked. Marissa's hand trembled as she pressed the mute button. She couldn't bear to hear another word. The twins' innocent faces smiled from the screen, pictures taken just months ago on their first day of second grade. Maya with her missing front tooth, Mia with her favorite butterfly clips. Now the media was turning them into monsters. Her chest felt tight, like she couldn't get enough air. These were her babies they were talking about. The same girls who helped her bake cookies for their teachers, who cried when they found an injured bird in the backyard, who still needed her to check under their beds for monsters at night. With shaking hands, Marissa reached for her phone. She stared at the number she hadn't dialed in years, her thumb hovering over the screen. Daniel Carter, United States Attorney General, her estranged husband, the man who walked away from their family when the pressures of his career became too much. She pressed dial before she could change her mind. The phone rang 3 times before his familiar voice answered. Daniel Carter speaking. Daniel, Marissa's voice cracked. It's me. The silence on the other end was deafening. She could picture him in his office, probably still wearing one of his expensive suits even at this late hour. Marissa? His voice was cautious, guarded. What's wrong? The girls. She swallowed hard, fighting back tears. They're in trouble, Daniel. Real trouble. The police arrested them this morning, they're saying. Her voice broke. They're saying our babies attacked Mrs. Beasley from down the street. What? The shock in his voice was genuine. That's impossible. I know that. You know that. But nobody's listening. Marissa wiped at her eyes with her free hand. They're treating them like criminals. They're just 7 years old, Daniel. 7. And they're being charged as adults. There was a long pause on the other end. When Daniel spoke again, his voice was hesitant. What do you need from me? I need your help, Marissa admitted, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. I know we have our issues, but this isn't about us. It's about Maya and Mia. They need their father. Another pause. Marissa could hear papers shuffling in the background. I'll help, he said finally, though she could hear the reservation in his voice. I'll make some calls tonight. Book the first flight out tomorrow morning. After hanging up, Marissa stared at the phone in her hand. The relief she'd expected to feel was tainted with doubt and old hurt. She'd spent years trying to protect the girls from the pain of Daniel's abandonment, and now she was the one bringing him back into their lives. The news anchor continued talking silently on the screen, the twins' photos still displayed prominently. Marissa sat alone in the darkness, wondering if she'd just made things better or worse for her daughters. Daniel Carter's polished leather shoes clicked against the marble floor of his Washington, D.C. office. Morning sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across his mahogany desk. The stack of paperwork before him seemed endless. Policy briefs, legal documents, and case files that demanded the U.S. Attorney General's attention. His phone buzzed and Daniel's heart stopped when he saw the caller ID. Marissa Carter. His ex-wife's name on the screen brought back a flood of memories. Their last fight, the sound of a slamming door, the silence that followed. His hand hovered over the phone, trembling slightly. "Hello?" His voice came out rougher than intended. "Daniel." Marissa's voice cracked, and he could hear the desperation in it. "I wouldn't call if I had any other choice." Daniel leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie. "What's wrong?" "It's the girls, Maya and Mia." Her words tumbled out, thick with emotion. "They've been arrested. They're saying our babies assaulted Mrs. Beasley from down the street. But they didn't do it, Daniel. They couldn't have." Daniel's chest tightened. The twins' faces flashed in his mind. He hadn't seen them in years, but he still remembered their gap-toothed smiles from the last Christmas he'd spent with them. "Judge Calloway is pushing to try them as adults," Marissa continued, her voice breaking. "They're just 7 years old, Daniel. 7. You have to help us. Please." Daniel rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of his position and his past pressing down on him. "Marissa, I can't just what?" Her voice turned sharp. "Can't help your own daughters? You're the U.S. Attorney General. If anyone can stop this injustice, it's you." The silence between them was heavy with unspoken accusations and years of hurt. Daniel stared at the American flag standing in the corner of his office, thinking about justice and responsibility. "The political implications," he started. "Don't you dare," Marissa cut him off. "Don't you dare hide behind your career again. You've done that enough. These are your daughters, Daniel, your flesh and blood. If you don't help them now, they could end up with records that will follow them forever." Daniel closed his eyes, remembering the day the twins were born. He'd held them, so tiny and perfect, and promised to protect them always. Some promise that had turned out to be. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I'll help," he said quietly. "I'll do what I can." "Thank you," Marissa replied, but her voice was guarded, uncertain. They both knew words were cheap, especially his. "I'll start looking into it right away," Daniel added, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Just don't let them down again," Marissa said softly, before ending the call. Daniel sat in his silent office, staring at the phone in his hand. The morning sun had climbed higher, and his coffee had gone cold. He had power now, influence that could help his daughters, but using it would mean confronting everything he'd run away from years ago. Daniel Carter's black government car pulled up to the curb of his old family home. The familiar suburban street felt foreign now, like a memory from someone else's life. Neighbors peered through their windows, their faces a mix of curiosity and judgment. Mrs. Thompson across the street crossed her arms and shook her head, clearly remembering the day he'd walked out years ago. His polished shoes crunched on the gravel driveway as he made his way to the front door. The garden, once meticulously maintained, now showed signs of neglect, much like the relationships he'd left behind. Daniel tugged at his tie, feeling suffocated by more than just the afternoon heat. The knock echoed through the wooden door. Each second of waiting felt like an eternity. When Marissa opened the door, time seemed to freeze. Her face, still beautiful but lined with years of struggle, hardened at the sight of him. The warmth that had once defined her was replaced by a cold, defensive wall. "Come in," she said, her voice clipped and formal, "but only because we have no choice." Daniel stepped into the familiar entryway. Family photos lined the walls, moments he should have been part of but wasn't. Birthday parties, school events, holidays, all celebrated without him. "Marissa, he began, but she cut him off sharply. "Don't." Her eyes flashed with anger. "Don't you dare try to apologize now. Where were you when the girls had their first day of school, their 10th birthday? Every single time they asked why their daddy didn't love them enough to stay?" Daniel flinched at her words. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said quietly. "Building my career, making sure you'd all be taken care of." "Taken care of?" Marissa's laugh was bitter. "We needed you here, Daniel. Not your money, not your career success. We needed their father." Movement in the hallway caught their attention. Maya and Mia stood there, holding hands, their young faces confused and frightened by the tension between their parents. Daniel's heart clenched at the sight of them, so grown up yet still so vulnerable. "What's happening?" Maya whispered to her sister. Mia squeezed her hand tighter, both girls watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. "Your career was always more important," Marissa continued, her voice shaking. "And now you show up, only because there's a high-profile case involved. Is that it, Daniel? Another chance to advance your career?" "That's not fair," Daniel protested, though the words felt hollow even to him. "I'm here because our daughters need help, because what's happening to them is wrong." "We needed you before this too," Marissa said, wiping away an angry tear. "But fine. We'll work together. For them. But don't think for a second this makes up for anything." Daniel looked at his daughters again, seeing the uncertainty in their eyes. The distance between them felt like an uncrossable chasm, but he knew he had to try. For their sake, he had to make this right. The night settled heavily over the Carter family home, bringing with it a suffocating tension that filled every corner. In the dimly lit living room, Marissa sat rigidly on the edge of the couch, while Daniel paced back and forth, his shoes making soft thuds against the carpet. "You're only here because it makes you look good," Marissa said, her voice sharp with accusation. "The great U.S. Attorney General swooping in to save his daughters. What perfect timing for your image." Daniel stopped pacing, his face flushed with anger. "That's not fair, Marissa. These are my daughters we're talking about. I'm here because they need help." "Need help?" Marissa let out a bitter laugh. "They needed help years ago, Daniel. Where were you then?" Up on the stairs, Maya and Mia huddled together in their pajamas, their small hands clasped tightly. The wooden steps creaked beneath them as they shifted uncomfortably, but their parents were too caught up in their argument to notice. "I was building a career that could provide for this family." Daniel's voice rose. "Everything I did was for you and the girls." "Oh, that's rich," Marissa shot back, standing up. "You abandoned us, Daniel. You chose your precious career over your own children. Do you know how many birthdays you missed? How many times they asked where their daddy was?" Maya squeezed Mia's hand tighter as tears welled up in her eyes. Mia wrapped her free arm around her sister's shoulders. "I made mistakes," Daniel admitted, his voice dropping slightly. "But I'm here now. I'm trying to make it right." "Make it right?" Marissa's voice cracked. "Our daughters are being accused of something terrible, and you think showing up now makes everything okay?" "At least I'm doing something," Daniel snapped. "I'm using every connection I have to help them. What would you rather do? Let them face this alone?" "Don't you dare suggest I wouldn't do everything for my girls." Marissa's words came out in a hiss. "I've been the one here, Daniel. I've been the one holding this family together while you were off climbing the political ladder." The twins watched as their father's shoulders slumped slightly. "You're not innocent in all this either, Marissa. You pushed me away. Every time I tried to come back, you made it clear I wasn't welcome." "Because you always left again," Marissa's voice broke. "Every single time you chose your career over us. How many times were we supposed to watch you walk away?" Maya tugged on Mia's sleeve, unable to bear any more. Together, they crept down the stairs and slipped into the kitchen. In the darkness, they held each other and cried quietly, their tears falling for reasons they couldn't fully understand. Back in the living room, Marissa and Daniel stood in exhausted silence, the weight of years of unspoken hurt hanging between them. Their anger had burned down to smoldering embers, leaving them both drained and bitter. Neither could find the words to bridge the gulf between them, and neither was ready to try. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Daniel Carter's Washington, D.C. office, casting long shadows across the polished conference table. Daniel sat at the head, his suit jacket draped over the chair, sleeves rolled up as he pored over case files with his legal team. "We need to focus on the lack of evidence," said James Mitchell, his lead counsel, pointing to a document. "The accusation relies solely on Mrs. Beasley's testimony." Daniel nodded, but his mind kept drifting to Marissa's face from the night before. The hurt, the anger, the years of pain etched in her expression. He rubbed his temples, trying to stay focused. "Sir?" Another attorney caught his attention. "The press is already running with this story. We need to get ahead of it." "My daughters aren't a PR opportunity," Daniel snapped, harsher than intended. The room fell silent. He softened his tone. I apologize. Let's stay focused on the legal strategy. The door opened and his assistant announced Marissa's arrival. She walked in, her posture stiff, avoiding eye contact with the team of lawyers. I won't let you turn this into a political circus, she said firmly, standing rather than taking a seat. These are our daughters we're talking about, not some case file. Marissa, please, Daniel stood up. We're trying to help. Help? She laughed bitterly. Like you helped when they were growing up? I found someone who actually cares about justice, not just optics. Who? Evelyn Lawson. She's been fighting cases like this for years. She understands what we're up against with Judge Calloway. The legal team exchanged concerned glances. James cleared his throat. Ms. Lawson's methods are unconventional. She's known for making waves. Maybe that's exactly what we need, Marissa challenged. Someone who isn't afraid to expose the truth. Daniel watched the tension build in the room. His team's discomfort was obvious, but so was Marissa's determination. He recognized that look. It was the same one she'd had when they first met, fighting for what she believed in. Let's meet with her, Daniel said finally. His team started to protest, but he held up his hand. Marissa's right. This isn't about politics or careers. This is about our daughters. Marissa's expression softened slightly, though the wall between them remained firmly in place. Evelyn wants to meet with both of us. She says we need to present a united front. Daniel nodded, dismissing his team with a gesture. When they were alone, the silence felt heavy with unspoken words. I know you don't trust me, he said quietly. But I'm not here for my reputation, Marissa. I'm here because I failed them. Failed you. And I can't do that again. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Prove it, she said finally. Show me you're really here for them this time. I will, he promised, whatever it takes. They stood there, separated by years of hurt, but connected by their shared concern for their daughters. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start, a fragile bridge built on the foundation of their children's future. The morning light streamed through the kitchen windows of the Carter family home, casting a warm glow that contrasted sharply with the cold atmosphere inside. Daniel and Marissa sat at opposite ends of the wooden table, their coffee cups untouched between them. The silence was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. She should be here any minute, Daniel said, checking his watch for the third time. Marissa nodded stiffly, her fingers drumming against the table. Just remember, this isn't about you or your career, Daniel. This is about our daughters. Before Daniel could respond, there was a knock at the door. Evelyn Lawson stepped into the kitchen, her presence commanding attention. She carried a thick briefcase and wore a determined expression that suggested she meant business. Good morning, Evelyn said, setting her briefcase on the table. Let's get started. Daniel's legal team filed in behind her, taking seats around the table. The kitchen suddenly felt cramped with all the suits and legal pads. Evelyn pulled out several files and spread them across the table. I've been tracking Judge Calloway's rulings for the past 5 years, she began. There's a clear pattern of racial bias in his sentencing, particularly in cases involving minority youth. Daniel leaned forward, his brow furrowed. That's a risky approach, Evelyn. Going after a judge's reputation? It's the truth, Marissa cut in sharply. And it's exactly what's happening to our girls. Evelyn nodded, pulling out more documents. Look at these statistics. In similar cases, white defendants consistently received lighter sentences or had their cases moved to juvenile court. The disparity is striking. Daniel's team exchanged worried glances. One of them spoke up. This could backfire. The political implications? The political implications? Marissa stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. Is that all you care about? My daughters are being treated like criminals because of the color of their skin, and you're worried about politics. Marissa, Daniel said, his voice tight with frustration. I know this system better than anyone in this room. We need to be strategic. No, Daniel, Marissa shot back. You know how to work the system for your own benefit. That's different. Evelyn raised her hand, commanding attention. Both approaches have merit. We need Daniel's expertise in the legal system, but we also need to address the underlying bias. This isn't just about Maya and Mia. It's about exposing a broken system. The tension in the room was palpable as Daniel and Marissa locked eyes across the table. Years of hurt and mistrust reflected in their gazes. "I want what's best for our daughters," Daniel insisted. "Do you?" Marissa's voice cracked slightly. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're more concerned with maintaining your reputation than protecting our children." The room fell silent. Evelyn watched the exchange with careful eyes, taking in the layers of pain and resentment between the couple. The case files lay spread across the table, forgotten for the moment as personal grievances took center stage. Daniel's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of Marissa's words hitting him hard. The morning light continued to stream through the windows, illuminating the dust particles dancing in the air, while the family's unresolved issues hung even heavier in the silence. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the Venetian blinds in Evelyn's office, creating striped patterns across stacks of legal documents spread across her desk. The small space felt even more cramped with the three of them inside. Evelyn behind her desk, Daniel and Marissa seated in chairs facing her, maintaining a careful distance from each other. "What I've found is disturbing," Evelyn said, pulling out a thick manila folder. "Judge Calloway's rulings show a clear pattern of discrimination." She spread several documents across her desk, pointing to highlighted sections. Daniel leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he scanned the papers. "These sentences, they're completely disproportionate." "Exactly," Evelyn nodded, pulling out more files. "Look at these cases from the past 5 years. Black children consistently received harsher sentences than their white counterparts for similar offenses. Some cases had barely any evidence at all." Marissa's hands trembled as she picked up one of the documents. "Just like our girls," she whispered. "There's more," Evelyn continued, opening another folder. "I've tracked dozens of cases where black families faced severe penalties, while similar cases involving white families were either dismissed or given minimal sentences. The pattern is undeniable." Daniel stood up, pacing the small office. His attorney's mind was already racing with possibilities. "This is enough to build a case against him. We can expose this systematic bias." "Daniel, wait," Marissa interrupted, her voice tight with worry. "You don't understand how things work in this town. Judge Calloway has friends everywhere. In the police department, the mayor's office, even the local media." "She's right," Evelyn added. "The judge has deep roots here. People trust him, respect him. Many won't want to believe he's capable of this kind of prejudice." Daniel turned to face them, his jaw set with determination. "That's exactly why we need to fight this. With my position in these documents—" "And what if it backfires?" Marissa cut in, standing up to face him. "What if challenging him only makes things worse for our daughters? Have you thought about that?" "We can't just let him get away with this." Daniel's voice rose with frustration. "And I can't let you turn our daughter's case into your crusade for justice," Marissa shot back. "This isn't about your career or your reputation, Daniel. This is about Maya and Mia." Evelyn cleared her throat, drawing their attention. "There's risk in either direction," she said calmly. "But these documents prove something we've suspected for years. The question is, what are we going to do with this information?" Daniel and Marissa stood facing each other, the weight of their decision hanging between them. The stack of damning evidence lay spread across Evelyn's desk, each page telling a story of injustice that couldn't be ignored. "I know you're scared," Daniel said softly to Marissa. "But we have to fight this, not just for our girls, but for all the families who've suffered under his prejudice." Marissa sank back into her chair, conflict evident on her face. "I just don't want to make things worse," she whispered. The evening settled over the Carter family home like a heavy blanket, bringing with it an uncomfortable silence that seemed to seep into every corner. In the kitchen, Marissa mechanically prepared dinner, her movements automatic as her mind wandered to darker places. The sound of Daniel's typing echoed from his makeshift office in the den, a constant reminder of the distance between them. Maya and Mia sat at the dining room table, homework spread before them, but their eyes kept drifting to their mother's tense shoulders, then to the closed door of their father's office. The twins exchanged worried glances, a silent conversation passing between them. "Girls, dinner in 10 minutes, Marissa called out, her voice strained with forced cheerfulness. Daniel emerged from his office, his tie loosened and his face drawn with exhaustion. "I got another call from the office today," he said quietly to Marissa. "They're not happy about this case." Marissa's hands stilled over the pot she was stirring. "Of course they're not," she muttered. "Your career always comes first, doesn't it?" The twins pretended to focus on their homework, but their pencils stopped moving. They'd grown used to these tense exchanges, but it didn't make them any easier to bear. Later that evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Marissa sat in the living room, her phone in hand. She scrolled through messages from her support group, women who had been there for her through the years when Daniel wasn't. Their words of encouragement brought tears to her eyes. "Sarah says I should consider what's best for the girls," she said when Daniel walked in. "They're all worried about what this case is doing to our family." Daniel loosened his tie further, slumping into an armchair. "My superiors made it clear today. If I continue pushing against Calloway, I might as well kiss my career goodbye." He ran a hand through his graying hair. "They know people, Marissa. Powerful people." "And what about our daughters?" Marissa's voice cracked. "Are they less important than your career?" Again? The silence that followed was deafening. From upstairs came the muffled sound of Maya and Mia talking in their room, their young voices carrying worry that no child should have to bear. Daniel stood up, moving closer to Marissa. "I promise you I won't abandon them again. Not this time. Not ever." Marissa looked up at him, her eyes filled with years of hurt and distrust. "Words, Daniel. They're just words." She stood up, wrapping her arms around herself. "You've made promises before." In his office, Daniel stared at the case file open on his desk. Judge Calloway's name seemed to mock him from the papers. His career or his family. The choice shouldn't have been difficult, but the weight of it pressed down on him like a physical thing. He touched the family photo on his desk, his fingers lingering over the smiling faces of his daughters, wondering if he could ever truly make things right. The tension in the Carter household had reached its breaking point. Marissa stood in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. Daniel paced the living room, his face etched with frustration. The air felt thick with unspoken accusations. "This isn't about the girls anymore, is it?" Marissa's voice trembled. "It's about your image, your career." Daniel spun around. "How can you say that? Everything I'm doing is for them." "Really?" Marissa laughed bitterly. "Just like everything you did before was for us? When you walked away?" Maya and Mia crouched in the hallway, their small hands clasped together. They watched their parents' shadows dance across the wall as the argument grew louder. "I made mistakes," Daniel's voice cracked. "I know that, but I'm here now." "Here now?" Marissa's voice rose. "When it's convenient for you? When it makes you look good to the press?" "That's not fair." Daniel slammed his hand on the table, making the twins jump. "I'm trying to save our daughters from a corrupt system." "Save them?" Marissa's eyes flashed. "Where were you when they needed saving before? When they had nightmares? When they asked why their daddy didn't love them enough to stay?" Maya squeezed Mia's hand tighter as tears rolled down both their cheeks. The sound of their parents' anger echoed through the house, each word a fresh wound. "I was building a career to provide for them," Daniel shouted. "They needed a father, not a provider," Marissa shot back. "They needed you here, not your money." The twins retreated to their bedroom, closing the door softly behind them. They climbed into Maya's bed, holding each other close as they had done so many times before. "I don't trust you anymore, Daniel," Marissa's voice carried through the walls. "How can I when you've proven time and time again that we're not your priority?" "Not my priority?" Daniel's voice broke. "I'm risking everything, my career, my reputation, to fight this case." "But can we trust you to stay when it gets hard?" Marissa's words hung in the air. "Or will you walk away again when it becomes inconvenient?" In their room, Maya and Mia pulled the blanket over their heads, trying to block out the sound of their family falling apart. Their tears soaked the pillowcase as they clung to each other, the only constant in their increasingly uncertain world. The house fell into an uneasy silence. Daniel retreated to his office, closing the door with a quiet click. Marissa sank into a kitchen chair, her head in her hands. The physical distance between them seemed to mirror the emotional chasm that had grown over the years. In the darkness of their room, Maya whispered to Mia, "Who's going to protect us if they can't even talk to each other?" Mia didn't answer, but her grip on her sister's hand tightened. The twins lay there, listening to the heavy silence of their fractured home, wondering if anyone could truly save them from what lay ahead. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Daniel's office, casting long shadows across the polished conference table. Daniel sat at the head, his fingers drumming anxiously against the wooden surface. Marissa sat opposite him, her posture tense but composed. The usual friction between them had been temporarily pushed aside as Evelyn Lawson spread a thick stack of documents across the table. "What you're about to see," Evelyn began, her voice steady and serious, "is evidence of systematic discrimination that goes back years." She pulled out several court transcripts, laying them side by side. Daniel leaned forward, his legal training kicking in as he scanned the documents. "These are all Calloway's rulings," Evelyn explained. "Look at the pattern." The team gathered around as Evelyn pointed out case after case, white defendants receiving minimal sentences or probation for serious offenses, while black families faced harsh punishments for minor infractions. The disparity was stark and undeniable. "He's been doing this for years," Daniel muttered, his face darkening as he read through the transcripts. "The bias is clear as day." Marissa's hands trembled as she picked up one of the documents. "These are families just like ours," she whispered. "Children torn from their parents." "We have enough here to prove intent," Evelyn said firmly. "This isn't just about bias. It's criminal abuse of power." Daniel stood up, pacing the room as he processed the information. "We need to take this public," he declared. "A press conference. Show everyone exactly what kind of man is sitting on that bench." Marissa's head snapped up. "Daniel, wait, have you thought about what that might mean for the girls? For our family?" "We can't stay silent," Daniel insisted, "not with this evidence." "I understand that," Marissa said, her voice tight with worry. "But these people have power. They have connections. What happens when we make enemies of them all?" The legal team exchanged glances as Daniel and Marissa faced each other across the table. The tension in the room was palpable. "I know you're scared," Daniel said, his voice softening slightly. "But this is bigger than us now. This is about every family that's been hurt by Calloway's corruption." Evelyn stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Marissa's shoulder. "We'll do everything we can to protect your family," she promised. "But Daniel's right. This needs to come out." After a long moment, Marissa nodded slowly. "Then we do it," she said. "We tell everyone." Daniel turned to his team. "Set up the press conference," he instructed. "It's time everyone knew the truth about Judge Calloway." The room burst into activity as the legal team began making calls. Reporters would need to be contacted, statements prepared, security arranged. The magnitude of what they were about to do settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Marissa watched the flurry of activity, her heart racing with a mixture of hope and fear. For the first time since this nightmare began, they had a real chance to fight back. But the cost of that fight still remained to be seen. The evening light cast long shadows across the Carter family living room as they sat together, the TV news droning in the background. Daniel leaned forward in his armchair, his tie loosened and jacket discarded, while Marissa perched on the edge of the sofa. Maya and Mia huddled close to their mother, their young faces etched with worry. "Breaking news tonight as Judge Calloway responds to allegations of judicial misconduct." The news anchor's voice filled the tense silence. Marissa's hand tightened around the remote. She'd been switching between channels all evening, watching their story unfold across different networks. Some praised their bravery, calling for immediate investigation into the justice system. Others questioned their motives, painting them as troublemakers seeking attention. "Turn it off, Mom," Maya whispered, her voice small but steady. "Please?" Daniel rubbed his temples, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "Maybe Maya's right. We've seen enough for tonight." But before Marissa could respond, a new headline flashed across the screen. Local teen arrested in connection with recent robbery. The image showed a young black teenager being led away in handcuffs. Judge Calloway's name prominently featured in the coverage. "This is no coincidence," Marissa said, her voice trembling with anger. "He's doing it again, Daniel. Right in front of everyone." Daniel stood up and paced the room, his shoulders tense. "He's trying to shift the narrative, make people forget about what we revealed." He stopped by the window, staring out at the gathering darkness. "And it's working. Look how quickly the media jumped on this new case." The twins exchanged worried glances, understanding more than their parents realized. Mia clutched her sister's hand tightly. "We can't let him get away with this," Marissa declared, standing up. "Another innocent child's life is at stake now." Daniel turned to face his family, his expression torn between determination and concern. "Fighting him has already cost us so much. The political pressure is mounting. My superiors are suggesting I consider my position." "So you're thinking of backing down?" Marissa's voice carried a sharp edge. "No," Daniel replied quietly. "I'm thinking about how to fight smarter." The news continued its coverage, showing crowds gathering outside the courthouse, some holding signs supporting Calloway, others demanding justice reform. The division in the community was clear and growing deeper by the hour. As the evening wore on, Maya and Mia slipped quietly into the hallway, but remained within earshot of their parents' conversation. They heard their mother's fierce determination, their father's strategic planning, and beneath it all, a shared understanding that they couldn't stop now. "We knew he wouldn't go down without a fight," Marissa said softly, her anger giving way to exhaustion. "But I never thought he'd drag another child into this." Daniel moved to sit beside her on the sofa. For the first time since his return, there was no tension in the gesture. "We'll find a way," he assured her. "We have to." From their spot in the hallway, Maya and Mia watched their parents, seeing not the conflict that had dominated their relationship, but a united front forming in the face of this new challenge. Despite their fear and confusion, they felt a glimmer of hope seeing their parents working together at last. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Daniel's office as the legal team gathered around the large conference table. Papers, legal documents, and coffee cups cluttered the surface. Daniel stood at the head of the table, his sleeves rolled up and his tie slightly askew. Marissa sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Evelyn arranged her files with practiced precision. "We need to think bigger," Evelyn announced, her voice firm and clear. "Local courts won't cut it anymore, not with Calloway's influence. We need to take this to the Supreme Court." The room fell silent. Daniel's legal team exchanged worried glances, but Daniel's expression remained focused, determined. "She's right," he said, placing his palms flat on the table. "We've seen how deep this corruption runs. The only way to truly expose it is to take it all the way to the top." Marissa shifted in her chair. "The Supreme Court?" Her voice wavered slightly. "Can we really do that?" "We have to," Evelyn replied, spreading out several documents. "Look at these patterns we've uncovered. It's not just about Maya and Mia anymore. There are dozens of families, hundreds of children who've been victims of this systemic bias. The Supreme Court needs to see this." Daniel's team began discussing the logistics, their voices overlapping as they debated strategy. But Daniel noticed Marissa's distant expression. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly. Marissa took a deep breath. "I've been so focused on our girls, on our family, but this is bigger than us, isn't it?" Daniel nodded. "Much bigger, but that doesn't make our fight any less important." "We've already received 3 threatening calls this morning," one of the junior lawyers interrupted. "People with connections to Calloway. They're trying to pressure us to drop this." "Let them try," Daniel said firmly. "We're not backing down." Evelyn pulled out more files. "If we present these cases together, showing the pattern of discrimination, the Supreme Court can't ignore it. But it won't be easy. The opposition will be fierce." "What about the girls?" Marissa asked. "How do we protect them through all of this?" "We keep them safe," Daniel assured her. That's non-negotiable. But we also show them that standing up for what's right matters, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. The team spent the next hour outlining their strategy. They would need to gather more evidence, prepare testimonies, and build an airtight case. The path to the Supreme Court would be long and challenging, but they all understood the stakes. "So we're really doing this?" Marissa asked, looking around the room at their determined faces. Daniel reached for her hand under the table, and for the first time in years, she didn't pull away. "We're doing this," he confirmed. "Together." Evelyn gathered her papers with a satisfied nod. "Then let's get to work. We have a long fight ahead of us." The legal team dispersed into smaller groups, each tackling different aspects of the case. The morning sun grew stronger, filling the office with light as they prepared for the biggest legal battle of their lives. The marble halls of the Supreme Court echoed with footsteps as Daniel Carter adjusted his tie one final time. Beside him, Marissa smoothed her navy blue blazer, her hands trembling slightly. Evelyn Lawson walked confidently ahead of them, her briefcase filled with months of meticulous research and evidence. "Remember," Evelyn whispered, "we have truth on our side." The main courtroom was already packed when they entered. Reporters filled the back rows, their notebooks ready. The polished wood panels and heavy red curtains gave the room a solemn atmosphere. Daniel felt the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders as he took his place at the counsel table. Marissa squeezed his hand before taking her seat in the gallery. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment, all their past conflicts seemed to fade away. They were here for one reason: their daughters. "All rise!" The marshal's voice rang out. The 9 Supreme Court justices filed in, their black robes rustling as they took their seats. Chief Justice Matthews adjusted his glasses, his stern gaze sweeping across the courtroom. Daniel stood, his heart pounding but his voice steady as he began their opening argument. "Your Honors, we stand before you today not just for Maya and Mia Carter, but for every child who has faced systemic bias in our justice system." He laid out the evidence methodically, the pattern of Judge Calloway's rulings, the statistical analysis showing clear racial bias, the testimonies from other families who had suffered similar injustices. The justices leaned forward, their expressions unreadable as they absorbed each detail. Justice Peterson interrupted with a sharp question. "Mr. Carter, how do you respond to the defense's claim that these are simply isolated incidents?" Daniel's response was immediate and passionate. "Your Honor, the evidence shows a clear pattern spanning over a decade. This isn't about isolated incidents. It's about systematic abuse of judicial power." From her seat, Marissa watched the back-and-forth exchange, her fingers twisted together in her lap. She could see the concentration on Daniel's face as he fielded questions from the justices. This was the Daniel she remembered, focused, determined, fighting for what was right. Evelyn presented next, her argument zeroing in on the constitutional violations in Calloway's court. The defense team tried to counter, but their arguments seemed weak against the mountain of evidence. Justice Chen's questions were particularly pointed. How do you explain the disparity in sentencing between similar cases? The defense attorney stumbled, his explanation falling flat in the silent courtroom. Marissa held her breath, hoping the justices could see through the weak justifications. As the session drew to a close, Daniel made his final remarks, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber. "Your Honors, this case represents more than just one judge's actions. It represents our commitment to equal justice under law, the very words carved above the entrance to this court." The Chief Justice nodded solemnly. "We will take this under advisement. Court is adjourned." The tension in the room slowly dissipated as people began to file out. Daniel gathered his papers while Marissa made her way to the counsel table. They walked out together, both physically and emotionally drained from the day's proceedings. Outside the courthouse, they paused on the steps, the afternoon sun warm on their faces. Marissa held on to Daniel's arm, neither speaking, both lost in their own thoughts about what would come next. The marble-columned Supreme Court chamber hummed with nervous energy. Daniel Carter sat rigid in his chair, his normally steady hands fidgeting with his tie. Beside him, Marissa gripped the wooden bench so tightly her knuckles turned white. Evelyn Lawson sat calmly on Daniel's other side, but her eyes betrayed her anticipation. The room was packed to capacity. Reporters lined the back wall, their pens poised over notepads. Community members, activists, and legal observers filled every available seat. The air felt thick with tension as everyone waited for the justices to enter. "All rise," the marshal called out. The 9 Supreme Court justices filed in, their black robes swishing as they took their seats. Daniel reached for Marissa's hand, and she squeezed it tightly. The Chief Justice cleared his throat and began to speak. "In the matter of Carter versus the state, regarding the judicial misconduct of Judge Thomas Callaway." He paused, shuffling his papers. Daniel held his breath. "This court finds, by a vote of 7-2, that Judge Callaway's actions represent a clear violation of constitutional rights and due process." The Chief Justice's voice rang clear through the chamber. "His pattern of discriminatory rulings and racial bias has no place in our justice system. Therefore, we uphold the petition to remove Judge Callaway from the bench, effective immediately." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Marissa's hand flew to her mouth as tears sprang to her eyes. Daniel pulled her close, his own eyes glistening. Around them, the courtroom erupted in applause. Evelyn touched both their shoulders, her smile wide and proud. "We did it," she whispered. The Chief Justice continued reading the full opinion, detailing how Callaway's actions had systematically discriminated against Black families and children. Each word felt like vindication for the months of struggle, the sleepless nights, and the emotional toll on their family. Cameras flashed as reporters captured the historic moment. Daniel held Marissa tightly, feeling years of tension finally release from his shoulders. They had won. Their daughters would be free. Justice had prevailed. When the justices filed out, the room buzzed with excitement. Legal experts were already discussing the landmark nature of the ruling. Reporters pressed forward, eager for comments. But Daniel, Marissa, and Evelyn stood quietly together, absorbing the magnitude of what they had accomplished. "Thank you," Marissa said softly to both Daniel and Evelyn. "Thank you for fighting with me." Daniel squeezed her hand. "We did this together." His voice was thick with emotion. "All of us." The victory felt both enormous and intimate, a public triumph that would change the legal system, but also a deeply personal win for their family. As they stood in the historic chamber, surrounded by the commotion of celebration, they knew that justice had finally been served. The warm glow of evening light filtered through the Carter family's living room windows. Daniel sat in his favorite armchair, while Marissa perched on the edge of the sofa. Maya and Mia huddled together on the love seat, their small hands intertwined. The Supreme Court victory still felt surreal, but the emotional exhaustion was very real. "I know winning doesn't fix everything," Daniel said softly, breaking the silence. His eyes met Marissa's, and she saw the regret there. "But I want to try." Marissa nodded slowly, her fingers twisting in her lap. "We need help," she admitted. "Professional help. All of us." The twins looked up at their mother's words. Maya squeezed Mia's hand tighter. In the therapist's office the following week, Daniel and Marissa sat on opposite ends of a plush beige couch. Dr. Sarah Bennett watched them carefully as they struggled to find the words. "Tell me about the abandonment," Dr. Bennett prompted gently. Marissa's voice cracked as she spoke. "He chose his career over us. Every single time." The pain in her words made Daniel flinch. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Daniel replied. His shoulders slumped. "I thought providing for them meant, but I was wrong. So wrong." In another room, Maya and Mia worked with their own counselor, drawing pictures of their feelings. Dark clouds and sharp angles filled their papers, expressing the confusion and fear they couldn't put into words. "I'm scared Daddy will leave again," Mia whispered during one session, tears rolling down her cheeks. Maya wrapped her arm around her sister's shoulders. Week after week, they returned to therapy. Daniel learned to listen without defending himself. Marissa began to share her deepest fears. The twins slowly started to process their trauma through art and play therapy. After a particularly intense session, Daniel and Marissa sat in their parked car, the silence heavy between them. Marissa stared at her hands for a long moment, before slowly reaching over. Her fingers found Daniel's, and though she didn't speak, the gesture said more than words could. That evening they gathered around the dinner table. The twins had helped set out plates of pasta, and Daniel had managed not to burn the garlic bread. As they passed the food around, the silence felt different. Not tense, but peaceful. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. "Would you like some more sauce, Daniel?" Marissa asked quietly. He looked up, surprised by the gentle tone in her voice. "Yes, thank you." The simple exchange meant everything. Small steps, but steps forward nonetheless. The evening sun cast long shadows through the Carter family's living room windows. Maya and Mia sat cross-legged on the floor, their homework spread out before them, but largely ignored. Daniel watched them from his armchair, noting how they seemed both older and more fragile than before. Marissa stood in the doorway, a cup of tea warming her hands. "Dad?" Maya's voice was quiet but steady. "Can we talk about something?" Daniel leaned forward, giving his daughter his full attention. "Of course, sweetheart. Anything." "Some kids at school still look at us funny," Maya continued, her fingers fidgeting with the corner of her notebook. "Like they're waiting for us to do something bad." Mia nodded, scooting closer to her sister. "Yesterday, Mrs. Thompson watched us the whole time we were in the library, like she thought we might steal something." Daniel's heart clenched. He moved to sit on the floor with his daughters, careful to give them space while staying close enough to show his support. "I'm so sorry you're going through this. It's not fair, and it's not right." "Will it always be like this?" Mia's voice cracked slightly. "Will people always think we're bad?" Marissa joined them, setting her tea aside. "No, honey. People's memories are short, and what matters most is that we know the truth." "But it still hurts," Maya whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Sometimes I have nightmares about that morning when the police came." Daniel reached out slowly, letting Maya decide if she wanted his comfort. When she leaned into his touch, he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I promise you both, I will never let anything like that happen to you again. I know I wasn't there before, but I'm here now and I'm not going anywhere." Marissa watched the interaction, feeling her own walls starting to crumble. She had held on to her anger for so long, using it as a shield against the pain of Daniel's absence. But seeing him now, truly present with their daughters, she felt something shift inside her. "Girls," Marissa said softly, "sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself. But you did nothing wrong. Nothing that happened was your fault." The twins looked at their mother, absorbing her words. Mia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Does that mean you're forgiving yourself too, Mom? For being angry?" Marissa's breath caught in her throat. "I'm trying, sweetie. Every day." Later that evening, they gathered around the dinner table. The usual tension that had marked their meals was noticeably absent. Maya and Mia shared small smiles across their plates, while Daniel and Marissa moved around each other in the kitchen with a newfound ease. The conversation was light, punctuated by comfortable silences. No one felt the need to fill every moment with words. Instead, they simply existed together, a family slowly finding their way back to each other. Daniel watched his daughters laugh at something Marissa said, and he felt the weight of gratitude in his chest. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but they would face them together. The morning light filtered through the blinds of Marissa's study, casting thin stripes across her desk. Papers lay scattered before her, but her attention was fixed on a single letter. The crisp white envelope bore an official letterhead from the National Criminal Justice Reform Initiative. Her fingers traced the edges of the paper as she read the words again. Daniel's footsteps echoed in the hallway before he appeared in the doorway. He paused, taking in the sight of Marissa lost in thought. The tension in her shoulders told him something significant was on her mind. "What's that?" he asked softly, not wanting to startle her. Marissa looked up, her eyes meeting his. "It's an invitation," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They want me to lead a new initiative for criminal justice reform, to help families like ours who've been wronged by the system. Daniel moved closer, carefully positioning himself near her desk. The morning sun highlighted the gray at his temples, evidence of the stress they'd all endured. "What are you thinking?" Marissa stood up, determination replacing the uncertainty in her expression. "I'm thinking about all the other families out there, families who don't have the resources we had, who don't have a U.S. Attorney General in their corner." She picked up the letter. "We can't just walk away now that our fight is over." She began gathering stories from other parents, setting up meetings in community centers and church basements. Each testimony she heard strengthened her resolve. A mother whose son spent 3 years in juvenile detention for a crime he didn't commit. A father whose daughter was tried as an adult at 15. Daniel watched her work, making his own calls to senators and representatives. He knew the system from the inside, knew which levers to pull. But watching Marissa work with these families showed him a different kind of power, the strength that comes from shared experience and collective action. Evelyn Lawson joined their efforts, offering her legal expertise and connections. "What you're building here," she told Marissa during one strategy session, "this could change everything. We're not just fighting individual cases anymore. We're fighting for systemic change." Back in her study, Marissa organized the growing stack of testimonies. Daniel stood in the doorway again, but this time the tension between them had softened into something else. Mutual respect, perhaps even the beginnings of trust. "I need to do this," Marissa said, turning to face him. "Not just for Maya and Mia, but for every child who might face what they faced." Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know," he said, "and I'll help however I can. We've seen what the system can do, both its flaws and its potential for change." They stood together in the morning light, the letter that had started it all still on Marissa's desk. The path ahead would be challenging, but they were ready to face it, not just as individuals fighting their own battles, but as partners in a larger struggle for justice. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as people filed in, taking their seats in the rows of folding chairs. Marissa stood at the podium, her hands steady despite the flutter in her stomach. The faces before her reflected stories similar to her own, parents who had watched helplessly as their children were wrongly accused, families torn apart by a biased system. "I know what it's like," Marissa began, her voice clear and strong, "to feel powerless, to watch your children suffer while the system that should protect them turns against them instead." Her words resonated through the room, drawing nods of understanding. Maya and Mia sat in the front row, watching their mother with pride. The twins had come so far from those frightened little girls in pajamas being led away by police. Now, at 13, they carried themselves with a quiet confidence born from surviving their ordeal. Evelyn Lawson stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, a slight smile on her face as she watched her former client become an advocate for change. The community center's walls were covered with posters announcing free legal clinics and support group meetings. "But we're not powerless anymore," Marissa continued. "Together we can make sure no other family goes through what we did alone." After the meeting, Maya and Mia helped distribute information packets about legal resources. They moved through the crowd with purpose, sharing quiet words of encouragement with other kids their age who had similar experiences. "Here," Maya said softly to a young girl who reminded her of herself. "This has numbers you can call if you need help." The girl took the paper with trembling hands, and Maya felt a surge of protectiveness. Meanwhile, Mia organized a sign-up sheet for the next youth support group meeting. "It helps to talk about it," she told a boy who looked uncertain. "Trust me, I know." Parents gathered around Marissa, sharing their stories, asking questions about the legal process. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from one of shared pain to shared purpose. That evening, the Carter family sat around their dinner table. The remains of a home-cooked meal lay before them as they discussed the day's events. "I met this girl today," Maya said, pushing her peas around her plate. "She reminded me so much of us, Mom, before everything changed." Mia nodded. "And did you see how many people showed up? There were way more than last time." Marissa reached across the table, squeezing Daniel's hand. "We're making a difference," she said softly. "It's slow, but it's happening. Daniel smiled at his daughters. You two were amazing today. I saw you helping those other kids. The twins shared a look, a silent understanding passing between them. They had found their own way to heal, by helping others who were still struggling. Next week's rally should be even bigger, Marissa said, her voice filled with quiet determination. Evelyn thinks we might even get some media coverage. The family continued their dinner, the conversation flowing easily between them. The weight of their past remained, but it no longer defined them. Instead, it had become the foundation for something larger than themselves, a movement for change, built one family at a time. Daniel sat at his desk surrounded by stacks of letters that seemed to grow taller by the day. The morning sun streamed through his office window, casting long shadows across the carpet. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since their Supreme Court victory, and his email inbox was overflowing with messages from people across the country. Another 3 cases just came in, he said as Marissa and Evelyn entered his office. All of them similar to ours, families torn apart by prejudiced judges and a broken system. Marissa picked up one of the letters, her fingers tracing over the handwritten words. This one's from Georgia, a mother whose teenage son was wrongfully convicted. She's been fighting for 5 years. The momentum is building, Evelyn said, settling into one of the chairs across from Daniel's desk. We're getting calls from advocacy groups in every state. They want to know how we did it, how we managed to take down someone as powerful as Calloway. Daniel loosened his tie, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. It's not just about Calloway anymore. These letters ... He gestured to the piles around him. These are real people, real families being destroyed by the same systemic racism we fought against. We need to do more, Marissa said firmly. She pulled out her notebook filled with contact information for community leaders and organizations. I've been talking with civil rights groups, setting up town halls. People want to tell their stories, Daniel. They need to be heard. As if on cue, Daniel's phone rang again. Another desperate parent, another story of injustice. He put it on speaker, and they all listened as a father from Michigan described how his daughter had been wrongfully accused, how the local judge had ignored evidence of her innocence. Evelyn began taking notes, her legal mind already working on strategies. We can use these cases to push for reform. The public is paying attention now. We need to strike while the iron is hot. I've been drafting legislation, Daniel said, pulling out a thick folder. Changes to judicial oversight, mandatory bias training, stricter consequences for judges who show patterns of discrimination, but getting it through Congress. That's where the public pressure comes in, Marissa interjected. The rallies I'm organizing, the town halls, we're building a movement. These aren't just isolated cases anymore. People are starting to see the bigger picture. They spent the next hour mapping out their strategy. Daniel would work the political angles, using his position to push for legislative change. Marissa would continue organizing at the grassroots level, giving voice to the families affected by judicial bias. Evelyn would coordinate with legal teams across the country, sharing their successful strategies and building a network of support. That evening, they gathered in the Carter family living room. Maya and Mia sat cross-legged on the floor, listening intently as their parents shared updates about their progress. I want to be just like you when I grow up, Maya said, looking at her father with newfound admiration. Fighting for people who can't fight for themselves. Mia nodded enthusiastically. Me too. I want to be a lawyer and help other kids who got accused of things they didn't do. Daniel and Marissa exchanged glances, their hearts full of pride and purpose. The fight had changed them all, transformed their family from victims into advocates. Though exhausted from the constant battle, they knew their work was far from over. Each letter on Daniel's desk represented another family waiting for justice, another story that needed to be told. The soft glow of evening lamps filled the Carter family living room, casting warm shadows across the walls. Daniel and Marissa sat together on the worn leather couch, a careful distance between them that spoke of years of separation. Maya and Mia's laughter drifted down from upstairs, a sound that still felt new and precious after everything they'd been through. Daniel's hands fidgeted in his lap as he turned to face Marissa. I need to say something, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Something I should have said years ago. Marissa tensed slightly but nodded, her eyes fixed on a spot on the carpet. I was wrong, Daniel continued, the words coming out rough and raw. When I left, when I chose my career over our family, I convinced myself I was doing the right thing, that providing for you meant being away, but I was wrong, so terribly wrong. In the hallway, Maya and Mia crept down the stairs, drawn by their father's voice. They huddled together, listening. You weren't there, Marissa said quietly, her voice trembling. When the girls had nightmares, when they were sick, when they needed their father at school events. You missed so much, Daniel. I know, he replied, his shoulders slumping. I can't get those years back. I can't undo the hurt I caused. But I want you to know how sorry I am. For leaving. For not being the husband and father you all deserved. Marissa's hands twisted in her lap. It's not just about the time you missed, she said. It's about the trust you broke. How do I know you won't leave again when things get hard? I don't expect you to trust me right away, Daniel said. I know I have to earn that back, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. These past months, fighting for our daughters, it's shown me what really matters. Maya squeezed Mia's hand as they listened, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. I want to try, Marissa said after a long pause. Not for me, but for our girls. They deserve to have their father in their lives. But Daniel, it has to be different this time. It will be, he promised. I know words aren't enough, but I'll prove it to you every day if you'll let me. Later that evening, the family gathered around the dining room table. The usual tension that accompanied their meals had softened, replaced by something gentler. Maya passed the salad bowl to her father, their fingers brushing briefly. Mia watched her mother's face, noting how the tight lines around her eyes had relaxed slightly. They ate together in a peaceful silence, broken occasionally by quiet requests to pass dishes or soft thank yous. It wasn't perfect. There were still hurt feelings and uncertainties, but it was a beginning. The first real family dinner they'd had in years where the weight of the past didn't feel quite so heavy. The grand ballroom of the Washington Convention Center hummed with anticipation. Hundreds of faces turned toward the stage where Daniel Carter stood at the podium, his hands resting firmly on its edges. The bright lights caught the silver at his temples, and his dark suit seemed to absorb the spotlight's glare. I stand before you not just as the U.S. Attorney General, Daniel began, his voice steady and clear, but as a father who nearly lost everything because of a broken system. Marissa sat in the front row, her back straight and her eyes fixed on Daniel. She watched as he shared their story, the false accusations against Maya and Mia, the bias they encountered, and the corruption they exposed. His words carried the weight of personal experience, making the statistics and legal jargon feel devastatingly real. When my daughters were handcuffed and taken away in their pajamas, Daniel continued, his voice catching slightly, I wasn't there. I had chosen my career over my family. But their ordeal opened my eyes to a truth many of you already knew. Our justice system isn't just broken. It's actively harming innocent families every day. The audience leaned forward, captivated. Marissa could feel the energy in the room shift as Daniel's words resonated with everyone present. Political leaders nodded in agreement, while activists scribbled notes furiously. After the speech, a crowd gathered around Daniel. Senators and representatives pressed business cards into his hands, eager to discuss potential legislation. Marissa stood to the side with Evelyn, watching the scene unfold. We need to do more, Marissa said quietly to Evelyn. These families need more than just policy changes. They need immediate support. Evelyn nodded, her eyes bright with understanding. A foundation, she suggested. Something that provides legal aid and support services to families facing wrongful accusations. Exactly, Marissa replied, her voice growing stronger with conviction. We could help families navigate the system, provide resources, connect them with attorneys who understand these cases. As the crowd thinned, Daniel made his way back to them. His tie was slightly loosened, but his eyes were alive with purpose. Evelyn quickly shared Marissa's idea, and Daniel's face lit up with approval. "We could combine our efforts," he said. "While I work on policy reform, the foundation could provide immediate assistance to families in need." The three of them found a quiet corner of the ballroom to discuss details. Evelyn pulled out her tablet, already mapping out the organizational structure and potential partnerships. Marissa felt a surge of excitement as their plans began to take shape. Later that evening, the family gathered in their hotel suite. Daniel and Marissa stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. The weight of the day's events settled around them like a comfortable blanket. "Thank you," Marissa said softly, "for telling our story." Daniel reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. They stood together in comfortable silence, both understanding that while their personal journey was far from over, they had taken an important step forward. Their fight for justice had grown beyond their family, becoming something larger than themselves. Maya and Mia Carter stood at the entrance of Jefferson Middle School, their backpacks feeling heavier than usual. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete steps as students streamed past them, some stopping to stare, others quickly averting their eyes. "Ready?" Maya whispered to her sister, squeezing her hand. Mia nodded, though her fingers trembled slightly. "Together," she replied. They walked through the main doors, the familiar smell of floor cleaner and cafeteria breakfast filling their nostrils. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before them, lined with blue lockers and decorated with student artwork. Whispers followed them like autumn leaves in the wind. "Those are the Carter twins, or did you see them on TV?" "I heard about their case." In homeroom, Mrs. Peterson greeted them with a warm smile. "Welcome back, girls," she said softly, gesturing to their usual seats near the window. Some of their classmates offered small waves or tentative smiles, while others buried their faces in their phones or notebooks. As weeks passed, the twins found their new normal. Some days were harder than others. During lunch, they often sat with their friend Sarah, who had stuck by them through everything. She never treated them differently, still sharing her mom's famous chocolate chip cookies and giggling about their favorite TV shows. But there were also the difficult moments, like when Jessica Martinez whispered "criminal" under her breath as she passed their desk in math class, or when Tommy Chen moved to a different lab partner in science, leaving Maya to work alone. Their weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Roberts became their sanctuary. In the calm office with its soft blue walls and comfortable chairs, they could finally let their guard down. "It's okay to feel angry," Dr. Roberts would say. "It's okay to feel scared or confused. These feelings don't make you weak, they make you human." Maya often spoke about her fear of being judged forever. "Sometimes I feel like that's all people will ever see when they look at us," she admitted during one session. Mia, usually the more outspoken twin, shared her own struggles. "I hate that some people still think we did something wrong, even after everything that happened in court." Their teachers became unexpected allies. Ms. Thompson, their English teacher, encouraged them to write about their experiences, telling them that their voices mattered. Mr. Garcia, who taught social studies, used their case as an example when discussing civil rights and justice, always checking with them first to ensure they were comfortable. One particularly challenging afternoon, after overhearing some kids making jokes about their case, the twins sat on their front porch. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I want to become a lawyer," Maya said suddenly, picking at a loose thread on her jeans. "Like Dad, but different. I want to help kids like us." Mia nodded, her eyes bright. "Me too. We could work together just like we always do. Maybe then we could stop this from happening to anyone else." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the neighborhood kids ride their bikes up and down the street. The weight of their experiences still pressed on their shoulders, but it felt lighter when shared between them. The conference room at the downtown community center buzzed with energy as Daniel and Marissa Carter sat at the head of a long oak table. Around them, community leaders and advocacy group representatives leaned forward in their chairs, notebooks open and pens ready. The afternoon sun filtered through tall windows, casting a warm glow over the determined faces gathered there. "We can't let this momentum slip away," Daniel said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "What happened to our daughters? It's happening to families across the country right now." Marissa nodded, spreading out a folder of documents before her. "We've identified 3 key areas where immediate action can make the biggest impact: legal aid accessibility, judicial oversight reform, and community education programs." Marcus Thompson, head of the Civil Rights Coalition, tapped his pen against his notepad. "The public is listening now. Your story has opened eyes that have been closed for too long." "Which is exactly why we need to act now," Daniel responded, standing to walk toward a whiteboard covered in action items. "I'm announcing my campaign next week, focusing specifically on justice reform. We'll be targeting the systemic corruption that allowed Judge Calloway to abuse his power for so long." Marissa looked up from her notes, her eyes bright with purpose. "And while Daniel works on the legislative side, I'm launching the Carter Family Justice Foundation. We'll provide legal support to families facing wrongful accusations, especially those who can't afford proper representation." The room erupted in supportive murmurs and nods of approval. Sarah Chen, a prominent civil rights attorney, raised her hand. "The legal community is ready to help. We've got dozens of lawyers willing to volunteer their time." Daniel returned to his seat beside Marissa, their shoulders touching slightly. The contact was brief but meaningful, a reminder of how far they'd come in rebuilding their own relationship while fighting for others. "We're looking at a 5-year plan," Marissa continued, passing out detailed proposals. "Phase 1 involves establishing legal aid clinics in 5 major cities. Phase 2 expands to rural areas where resources are even more limited." As the meeting progressed, Daniel and Marissa moved through their presentation with practiced precision. They outlined plans for rallies, detailed their legislative agenda, and discussed strategies for maintaining public attention on the issue. Later that afternoon, they stood together at a podium in the community center's main hall, facing a room full of reporters and supporters. Camera flashes punctuated the air as Daniel stepped up to the microphone. "Today marks the beginning of a new chapter in our fight for justice," he announced, his voice strong and clear. "We're not just talking about change anymore. We're making it happen." Marissa took her place beside him, their hands clasped together in a show of unity. "The Carter Family Justice Foundation will ensure that no family has to face these battles alone," she added, her words carrying across the hushed room. The family stood together on that stage, their presence a testament to survival and determination. Maya and Mia, watching from the front row, beamed with pride at their parents' strength and commitment. The warm glow of the dining room lights cast a gentle shine over the Carter family dinner table. Steam rose from plates of home-cooked food as Daniel, Marissa, Maya, and Mia settled into their chairs. It had been exactly 1 year since the Supreme Court ruling that changed their lives forever. "I can hardly believe it's been a year," Marissa said softly, passing a bowl of mashed potatoes to Maya. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and other times it feels like a lifetime ago." Daniel nodded, his eyes meeting his wife's across the table. "We've come so far since then. The foundation is helping dozens of families now. And Mom's speaking engagements are making real change," Mia added proudly. "My friend Jessica's mom said she cried during your last speech." Maya smiled at her sister. "Remember how scared we were at first? Now look at us. We're actually helping other kids who are going through what we did." "I've been thinking about law school," Maya continued, her voice growing more confident. "After everything we've been through, I want to be there for other families. I want to make sure no one else has to face what we did alone." "Me too," Mia chimed in. "We could be a team, like Mom and Dad are now." Daniel set down his fork, emotion flickering across his face. "I'm so proud of both of you. You've turned something painful into something powerful." "It wasn't easy," Marissa admitted, reaching for Daniel's hand. "There were days I didn't think we'd make it, but looking at our family now, I know every struggle was worth it." "Remember those first community meetings?" Maya asked. "How nervous we all were?" "Now look at us," Mia grinned. "We're practically professionals at public speaking." "The hardest part was learning to trust again," Daniel said quietly. "Not just each other, but the system itself, learning how to fight it while still believing it could change. Marissa squeezed his hand. We had to learn how to be a family again, too. That took just as much work as fighting the legal battle. I think that's what made us stronger, Maya reflected. We didn't just fight the case, we fought for each other. And we're still fighting, Mia added, but now we know how to do it together. After dinner, the family stepped out onto their back porch. The night was clear, and stars dotted the dark sky above them. They stood together, shoulders touching, looking up at the vast expanse of twinkling lights. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no tension, no urgent battle to fight, no immediate crisis to solve. Just a family, standing together, stronger for everything they'd endured. Thank you, Maya said suddenly, her voice soft. Both of you, for fighting for us, for not giving up. We'll never give up, Daniel replied, wrapping an arm around his daughter's shoulders. Not on you, not on each other, and not on making things right. Marissa pulled Mia close, and they all stood there, united under the starlit sky, feeling the peace they'd fought so hard to find. The prestigious university campus buzzed with activity as Maya and Mia Carter walked through its historic gates. Autumn leaves crunched beneath their feet, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the red brick buildings. The twins, now 18, carried their law textbooks close to their chests like shields. Ready? Maya asked, glancing at her sister. Mia nodded, though her fingers nervously played with the strap of her backpack. As ready as I'll ever be. They entered the lecture hall for their first law class. The room was grand, with high ceilings and rows of wooden seats arranged in a semicircle. Other students filtered in, some casting curious glances their way. The Carter case had made national headlines, and even now, years later, their name carried weight. Professor Richardson, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair, stood at the podium. Welcome to Introduction to Criminal Law, she began, her eyes scanning the room before settling briefly on the twins. Today we'll discuss how bias can influence judicial decisions. Maya and Mia exchanged knowing looks. They'd lived through exactly what the professor was describing. During the class discussion, a student raised his hand. Aren't the Carter twins in this class? The ones from the Supreme Court case? The room fell silent. Maya felt her cheeks warm, but she sat up straighter. Mia reached for her sister's hand under the desk. Yes, Maya said clearly. That's us. Professor Richardson smiled encouragingly. Would you be willing to share your perspective on today's topic? Mia spoke first, her voice steady despite her nerves. Our experience showed us how deeply bias can run in the justice system. We were just kids when we were accused of something we didn't do. The system wasn't designed to protect us, Maya added. It was ready to condemn us before we even had a chance to defend ourselves. That's why we're here now, to change things from the inside. Their words resonated through the lecture hall. Other students leaned forward, engaged by their first-hand account of injustice and determination. Later that afternoon, at a student-run event about criminal justice reform, Maya and Mia stood together at the podium. The audience packed the small auditorium, eager to hear their story. We could have let that experience break us, Maya said, her voice carrying across the silent room. Instead, it gave us purpose. Mia nodded, continuing where her sister left off. Our family fought back against corruption and won. But there are so many others out there who don't have the resources or support we had. They're the reason we're pursuing law. The crowd responded with enthusiastic applause. As students approached them afterward to share their own stories or express support, Maya and Mia realized they'd found their place. They weren't just the wrongfully accused Carter twins anymore. They were future lawyers with a mission. Walking across the campus quad after the event, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Maya bumped her shoulder against Mia's. Can you believe we're really here? She asked. Doing exactly what we always dreamed about, Mia replied, smiling. Making a difference. They paused by the law library, its imposing facade representing everything they hoped to achieve. The weight of their textbooks felt right in their hands, not a burden, but a tool for change. Maya and Mia Carter stood at the steps of their hometown courthouse, a building that once filled them with dread. Now, as accomplished lawyers, they felt a different kind of nervousness, the kind that comes with purpose and determination. "It feels strange being back," Maya said softly, adjusting her blazer. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. Mia nodded, squeezing her sister's hand. "But this time we're here to make things right." Their parents, Daniel and Marissa, stood proudly behind them. Daniel's hair had grayed at the temples, and Marissa's face showed gentle lines of wisdom, but their eyes still burned with the same passion that had driven their fight for justice years ago. A small crowd had gathered in front of the courthouse, community leaders, local families, and faces both familiar and new. Some were the same people who had once whispered about their family, but today they wore expressions of respect and support. "Look who's here," Mia whispered, nodding toward Mrs. Johnson, their old middle school teacher who had stood by them during the darkest days. She sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Maya stepped up to the podium, her voice clear and strong. "Years ago, this town taught us a hard lesson about justice, or the lack of it. Today, we're here not to dwell on past hurts, but to build a better future." As Maya spoke, Marissa watched her daughters with tears in her eyes. These weren't the scared little girls who had once been wrongfully accused. They had grown into powerful advocates for change. The sisters announced their new initiative, a legal clinic that would provide free representation to families facing wrongful accusations. The crowd broke into applause when they revealed that the clinic would be named after Mrs. Beasley, whose false accusation had started their journey. "We're turning pain into purpose," Mia explained to the gathered crowd. "This clinic will ensure that no child in our town ever faces what we faced without proper legal support." Daniel stepped forward to address the community leaders. "My daughters have shown me what true courage looks like. They've taught me that justice isn't just about winning cases. It's about changing hearts and minds." Local community organizers lined up to pledge their support. Pastor Williams offered church space for community meetings. The local bar association promised pro bono hours. Even the current mayor, who had been a critic years ago, stood up to publicly apologize for the town's past failures. Marissa watched it all unfold, remembering the lonely nights when she had wondered if their family would ever heal. Now, seeing her daughters command respect in the very place that had once condemned them, she felt a deep sense of peace. The afternoon sun began to set as Maya and Mia walked through their old neighborhood, greeting families and sharing their vision for the future. Children ran up to them, asking questions about becoming lawyers. Parents sought advice about ongoing cases. "Remember when we used to ride our bikes here?" Maya asked, passing their old house. "Now we're riding for justice," Mia replied with a smile. The Carter family gathered at the community center where local leaders had organized a reception. As they mingled with supporters and discussed plans for the clinic, there was a palpable sense of change in the air. The town that had once turned its back on them was now embracing their mission for justice. The midday sun blazed overhead as thousands of people gathered in the heart of Washington, D.C. Signs waved in the air, bearing messages of hope and demands for change. The Carter family stood together on the stage, their presence commanding attention from the massive crowd before them. Daniel adjusted his tie, taking in the sea of faces. Marissa squeezed his hand, offering silent support. Maya and Mia, now accomplished lawyers themselves, stood tall beside their parents, their matching navy suits a symbol of their unity. "We gather here today," Daniel's voice boomed through the speakers, "not just as victims of injustice, but as warriors for change." His words carried across the crowd, drawing them in. "Years ago, my daughters were wrongfully accused. They were just children, innocent children whose lives were nearly destroyed by a system that failed them." The crowd grew silent, hanging on his every word. Marissa watched her husband with pride, remembering how far they'd come from those dark days. "But we fought back," Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger. "We fought not just for Maya and Mia, but for every child who has faced prejudice in our justice system. Every family that has been torn apart by bias and corruption." Maya stepped forward to the microphone, her voice clear and steady. "I was 7 years old when I learned that justice isn't always just." She paused, letting her words sink in. "My sister and I were handcuffed and taken from our home in our pajamas. We were treated like criminals before we could even understand what that meant. Mia joined her sister, their shoulders touching. But today we stand before you not as victims but as advocates. We're lawyers now, fighting to ensure no other child experiences what we did. The crowd erupted in applause, many wiping tears from their eyes. Several politicians in the front row nodded solemnly, their expressions serious as they took notes. Daniel returned to the microphone, outlining specific reforms needed in the justice system. He spoke about mandatory bias training for judges, reforms in juvenile justice, and the need for greater accountability in the legal system. Change doesn't come from silence, he declared, his voice passionate. It comes from standing up, speaking out, and demanding better. It comes from all of us, working together, refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. The crowd roared their approval, signs waving with renewed energy. Several prominent senators and representatives made their way toward the stage, eager to discuss collaboration on reform initiatives. As the family finished their speeches and walked off the stage together, the chants of the crowd followed them. Justice, reform, change. Marissa held her daughters close as they descended the steps. Daniel wrapped his arm around his family, feeling the magnitude of the moment. They had come so far from those terrifying days when their daughters were wrongfully accused, yet they knew this was just another step in their ongoing journey for justice. The sounds of the rally continued behind them, a powerful reminder that their fight for change now belonged to thousands of others too. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows of the Carter family home, casting a warm glow over the breakfast table. Daniel, his hair now silver, sat at the head of the table, watching his family with quiet contentment. Marissa, elegant in her age, poured coffee for everyone while their grandchildren eagerly reached for pancakes. Maya and Mia, both successful attorneys now, sat with their own children, sharing stories and laughter. The years had been kind to the twins. Their faces showed wisdom earned through struggle and triumph. "Remember when we couldn't even ride our bikes without fear?" Maya said softly, watching her daughter Katie devour a stack of pancakes. Mia nodded, her eyes distant with memory. "And now look at us. Our kids can play freely, without the weight we carried." Daniel reached for Marissa's hand under the table. "We've come so far," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But there's still work to be done." "Grandpa," little Marcus, Mia's son, piped up, "Mom says you helped change the law. Is that true?" Daniel smiled, looking at his grandson. "We all did, Marcus. Your grandmother, your mothers. We fought together." Marissa set down her coffee cup. "It wasn't easy," she said, her voice steady. "But we learned that standing up for what's right is always worth it." Maya leaned forward, addressing her nieces and nephews. "That's why your mom and I became lawyers. We wanted to make sure other families wouldn't have to go through what we did." "And we're not done yet," Mia added, sharing a knowing look with her sister. "There are still battles to fight, still changes to make." Daniel watched his daughters with pride. They had grown into powerful advocates for justice, their childhood trauma transformed into purpose and strength. He thought about his own journey, from absent father to champion for change, and felt profound gratitude for the second chance his family had given him. "The foundation is expanding," Maya announced, reaching for the syrup. "We're opening 3 new offices next month." "And the reform bill is gaining support in Congress," Mia added. "We might actually see it pass this year." Marissa beamed at her daughters. "You've taken what we started and made it so much more," she said softly. The grandchildren listened intently, absorbing the weight of their family's legacy. They might be too young to fully understand now, but the seeds of justice and determination were already taking root in their hearts. "Tell us more about when you were little," Katie asked her mother, Maya. "About how you fought back." Maya exchanged glances with her sister. "Well," she began, "it all started with a bike ride and a wave to a neighbor." The morning sun continued to rise, warming the kitchen filled with 3 generations of Carters. Their story wasn't just about overcoming injustice anymore. It was about creating lasting change, about building a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. The grand ballroom sparkled with elegant lighting as hundreds of distinguished guests gathered for the National Justice Reform Awards. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the sea of faces, all turned toward the stage where the Carter family stood together. Daniel's hand trembled slightly as he gripped the podium. Marissa stood beside him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Maya and Mia, both in elegant evening wear, flanked their parents, their presence a testament to how far they'd come from those terrifying days of their childhood. 20 years ago, Daniel began, his voice steady despite his emotion. Our family faced a nightmare that changed us forever. 2 innocent little girls were wrongfully accused, and a system meant to protect them failed completely. Marissa squeezed his hand, offering silent support as he continued. The audience sat in rapt attention, many wiping away tears as they remembered the Carter family's story that had captured national headlines. Maya stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. Our parents could have chosen to retreat after winning our case. Instead, they decided to fight, not just for us, but for every family facing similar injustice. They taught us that true justice requires more than winning a single case, Mia added, her words resonating through the hushed ballroom. It requires changing the system itself. The presenter approached with the gleaming award, a beautiful crystal sculpture symbolizing the breaking of chains. As Daniel accepted it, the audience rose in a standing ovation that thundered through the room. This award, Marissa spoke, her voice thick with emotion, belongs not just to us, but to every family who has stood up against injustice, to every child who has faced wrongful accusations, to every parent who has fought for their children's future. Maya and Mia shared a glance, both remembering the scared little girls they once were. Now they stood as accomplished attorneys, carrying forward their parents' legacy of fighting for justice. Our story isn't just about what happened to us, Maya continued, addressing the crowd. It's about what happens when people refuse to accept injustice, when they stand up and say enough. The applause grew louder, and faces in the crowd nodded in agreement. Many were families who had been helped by the Carter Foundation, their own stories of triumph over injustice made possible by the path the Carters had blazed. Daniel looked at his family, at Marissa, who had never lost faith, at Maya and Mia, who had transformed their pain into purpose. His heart swelled with pride and love. "We accept this award," he said, holding the crystal sculpture high, "with gratitude and humility. But more importantly, we accept it as a reminder that our work isn't finished. There are still families out there facing the same battles we once did. Our fight continues." The entire ballroom erupted in another standing ovation. Maya and Mia embraced their parents, tears flowing freely now. They stood together on the stage, a family united not just by blood, but by their unwavering commitment to justice. If you enjoyed the story of Marissa, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.